There we go. So, welcome everyone today. My name is Tim. I'm an alcoholic. Um, Concept 11. Before I say anything else, if what I say helps, marvelous. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. I don't speak for AA. So, Concept 11. Let's read the GB one first. While the trustees, acting together as the General Service Board, Great Britain, hold final responsibility for AA's service administration, they should always have the assistance of the best possible committees, service executives, staffs and consultants. Therefore, the composition of committees and service assemblies, the personal qualifications of their members, the manner of their induction into service, the systems of their rotation, the way in which they are related to each other, the special rights and duties of our executive staffs and consultants, together with a proper basis for the financial compensation of these special workers, will always be matters for serious care and concern. Now, the problem with talking about this concept is that it's all about the structures put in place to support and facilitate the work of the General Service Board. Now, so far so good, except the structure written about by Bill in the essays in the 1950s or so is different than the structure in New York today, and is different than the structure in York in England today. So what I'm not going to do is give you a history lesson about what the General Service Office and the corporations were like in the 1950s. I can give you names of people who can talk about that. I'm not going to tell you what the structure is today or what the structure is in the UK. What I'm more interested in here is the general principles which are set out in this, because that's what's going to be of general application in other countries and in other fellowships and so on. So there are lots of general. Let me just have a look at how I've structured these notes. Right, so I've got some general principles. I've got some notes on the various subcommittees as they were there, or committees actually, as they were there in the 1950s. I've got some other general principles, and then I've got application in life. So this is just in the order in which the principles arise. I think it's interesting. It says the General Service Board, the trustees acting together as the General Service Board. Now that's just in the GB version, but there is the notion that the General Service Board is it's a corporate body. It's not a bunch of individuals. It's a corporate body. It's a single spiritual entity, same way that the group in the traditions is defined as a single spiritual entity. Okay, so it's made up of individuals, but it acts as a collective body. What's very curious is that if you remember from concept 1, it talks about the final responsibility and ultimate authority for world services or British AA services resides in the collective conscience of our whole fellowship. And you think, well, you're done now with final responsibility. That's where final responsibility rests. And then suddenly, in the middle of concept 11, when you're least expecting it, what you least expect, the phrase final responsibility pops up again. Which means that if you imagine AA as the upside down triangle with final responsibility and ultimate authority sitting at the top, it gets delegated down and leaves some of itself at each level. So by the time you get down to the board, some of that final responsibility has been delegated. Now, in principle, I mean, it's not final responsibility for everything. It's final responsibility for a specific thing. In this case, in the GB concept 11, it's AA's service administration. in the World Service version, it's AA's World Service Administration. But each level is with final responsibility is treated as though it has got financial responsibility, which means that the buck stops there. But in extreme situations, the level above can veto. And so that's there's a general principle there that although you're delegating authority down, and the level which accepts the responsibility, the buck stops with them. You quietly whisper, actually, it doesn't really stop there. The final responsibility resides higher. You can appeal to the higher level. The higher level can override in extreme situations. But from a pragmatic point of view, from a practical point of view, whoever's responsible for something, the buck stops with them. They can't just pass the buck to another level. And the other main thrust of Concept 11 is the board doesn't do everything itself. Now, that was talked about a little bit in Concept 8, and now this is the fleshing out, really, of Concept 8. And therefore, the General Service Board has to delegate all sorts of things down to other types of personal entity. And the four categories it's got are so-called committees or standing committees. I'm just adopting the wording from the GB form and the World Service form. Committees or standing committees. Corporate service directors or service executives, that's really higher level employees. Those are the bosses. You've got staffs, that's the lower level employees, and then consultants. So you've got committees, higher level employees, lower level employees, and then externals. And there's a slightly different structure in according to the concept itself in GB and in America. So the committees in this country, the board's got its own little secret committees, like the nominations committee, and not even a mouse is allowed to go and sit in on those. They're super secret. And then you have these things called subcommittees, which are presided over by a board member, but have a bunch of people from the fellowship who actually do the work. And those are for specific disciplines like telephones or electronic communications or young people in AA or whatever, health liaison. The concept also refers to service assemblies. It's really not clear. I'd have to research the history to find out what they meant by that. The only service assemblies I'm aware of are actually part of the fellowship. They're not subject to the board in any way. So who knows? Whatever that was meant by that, there's no practical manifestation of that today as far as I can see. And then from a World Service point of view, the American version of these, they have these things called standing committees and service boards, and we're going to come to more of those. The concept also talks about, when you're looking at this, onward delegation by the board to the various people who are doing the actual work. There are various aspects which are significant. So who's going to do the job, what qualifications they have, how they're inducted into service, rotation system, so are they there forever, or do they have to leave after a certain while? Do they switch jobs in between? How they relate to each other, rights, duties, and compensation. What else do we have? There is also this idea contained in the wording of the concept itself that AA success, which is what it's doing positively, and AA security, which is its protection against bad stuff from happening. So those are the two sides of it. Success and security require competent leadership. Now, all of these people who are not on the board, the employees, the consultants, blah, 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 they're the ones who are facing the public. They're the ones who are facing external organizations. They're really the face of AA. They're the ones who are doing the bulk of the work. So the leadership of AA actually resides to a huge extent in employees, in consultants, in people doing service on behalf of the board, the non-alcoholic trustees. Um, uh, the responsibility for AA's success and security lies in a whole bunch of people who are not necessarily even members of AA or part of the fellowship. Like the employees are not necessarily members of AA. But they're the ones who are going to be primarily responsible for our public image. So we've got to be really careful who we pick to do those jobs and how they operate. It's got to be very carefully organized. And I think this is true in any outward facing role in AA, that someone who is um, doing 12-step work outside the fellowship, who's carrying the message outside the fellowship, who's transacting in any way at all, AA is on show. You've got to be super careful who you pick. And you're picking the person for the role, not the role for the person. So, it might be great for Jennifer's recovery to be the public information officer, but, there could be serious problems with Jennifer which she hasn't yet resolved, and she might not be the best person to represent AA. We've had loose cannons in the past in the service structure, and it causes a lot of damage. The various committees, so the Bill's essay on the essays on the concepts, and his essay on this concept in particular goes into a lot of detail about exactly how the committees, this is the World Service Committees, were structured in the 1950s. Now, he was aware that this was going to change, so why did he write it down? Because I think because he wanted us to understand the thinking and the logic behind it. So the structure as it was presented in the 1950s is like the worked example for a number of general principles of universal application. And he wanted the history there embodied and enshrined in these essays, so it couldn't be just swept aside and forgotten and changed in a cavalier manner. So the committees he talks about, there are 5 of them. One of them, so the first one is the nominations committee. So they're in charge whenever whenever there's a vacancy on the board, whenever there's a vacancy at the higher or lower levels of employment, whether there's a new consultant is needed. So it could be a publishing consultant, it could be a legal consultant. The nominations committee is in charge of picking the person. And the 3 the 3 characteristics it talks about are competence, stability, and industry. You've got to be good at what you do, you can't be a basket case, and you've got to be a hard worker. And it's interesting, this is mentioned at more than one juncture in the concepts. The necessity, I think concept 9, it's covered in great detail, is emotional stability being a prerequisite for service within AA. You don't often hear about that. I've been at a lot of elections, and there is very rarely any investigation of the emotional stability of the person standing for the role. But you know what? Totally valid topic. It's all very well having a lovely service CV and being very competent and very industrious, but if you're liable to fly off the handle, and if you're react, and pouty and full of sighs, the sighers at service meetings, they can't can it, can they? They can't keep it in the bottle. Stability really helps. The process of assessing candidates, very careful deliberation it talks about. We talked about this before, don't just say, who's free first hand that goes up gets the job. Careful deliberation. It talks about painstaking investigation and interviewing. It's, oh, cat. Oh, she's in. Damn. Um, Hopefully she'll be reasonably quiet. Let's just close the door for Jonathan. No, sorry about this. Give me a moment. Sorry about that. She's fine. No animals were hurt in the making of this recording. Um, Painstaking. Okay, so the process of assessing candidates: careful deliberation, painstaking investigation, and interviewing. So it is okay to interview people. I mean, it doesn't have to be. You don't have to, grill them in an unpleasant way, but you ask enough questions that they show their hand. Um, it talks about a refusal to accept casual recommendations. Sometimes someone stands for a post, and they're not known to the body who is going to be electing them. That doesn't work. You can't have someone just show up out of thin air, albeit with a service CV, without a casual recommendation. If you recommend yourself, that's a casual recommendation. You ought to be recommended by someone else. So if you're going to go for service at region, you need to really have a letter from Intergroup say, yeah, this person did service at Intergroup and they were great. The problem with the service CV, and I experienced this only on one occasion really, where it's been really egregious. There was a case where there was someone who had this stellar service CV, but when they were in the job they were elected to do were catastrophic. Um, in the sense of exercising very poor judgment, rubbing everyone up the wrong way, um, unboundaried. Afterwards, a friend of mine remarked that the service CV is good at telling you what roles someone has held, but it's not good at telling you how well they discharged those roles. It doesn't tell you how other people enjoyed having them being the head of this or the chair of that. But that's important. So the service CV alone is not enough. Talks about preparation well in advance of suitable candidates, avoidance of haste or snap judgment, and bewaring the tendency to reject the first rate out of fear of being outshone, particularly in employment situations. So the second committee is the Finance and Budgetary Committee. I have a couple of questions here. How would you go about practically determining personal stability in a service vacancy scenario? If you've got the person in front of you and you ask a few questions, you'll find out. You can see from the way they handle being asked questions. Once I was at a region meeting and I asked a question about the concepts or something, and the person said, I knew you would ask that. I'm just reporting it. And anyone paying attention would have taken that to be a superficially humorous response belying an emotional reaction, affront that the question even be asked. At group level, it's really good for people going for things like GSR or treasurer or chair to have been going to the meeting, going to the group for a year. Because if someone's going to act out, they will have acted out within a year. So people know. And in my observation, people instinctively go for stability and they're rattled by instability. But you've got to know the person. Do you check references? Yes. So if someone comes along with a little, I mean, normally what you would do, let's say the chair of region would get would let's say someone's going for health liaison at region and they're unknown to region. Um, they would write to the intergroup. The person would say, well, I belong to this intergroup. The chair might write to the intergroup and say, could you please recommend so and so, so that the communication is coming from the intergroup which is doing the recommendation. So in a sense, you don't need to check it. It's because you're getting the recommendation from the horse's mouth. Next committee, Finance and Budgetary Committee. Its job is to ensure solvency, to keep the business afloat. Talks about keeping on top of income and expenditure, finding ways to increase income, and he uses this wonderful phrase, to keep a cold and watchful eye. Isn't that a great image? A cold and watchful eye on needless cost, waste, and duplication. He talks about having a robust budgeting and forecasting process, flexibility as the year progresses and updating and adjusting budgets and forecasts, keeping substantial savings. We're going to cover that more in Concept 12, which covers the whole prudent reserve business. Making sure that a large proportion of these savings is at call. So you can, if something happens, you don't have to wait a year to access the funds. The funds are there. And he talks about the danger of oversaving and underspending, which can impair your ability to do service. In the fellowship, it can discourage contribution if the General Service Board is seen as incompetent, because it's not getting the job done, because it's basically not spending enough to get it done. A good example is, let's say you've got a shoddy old website. Let's say an AA entity in some country has a shoddy website because it hasn't got the money. It's basically underspending compared to what people need. People think, why should we give money to the General Service Office? Look at the crappy website they've got. Well, it becomes circular. So there's a balance here between prudence and not shooting yourself in the foot in terms of being excessively cautious. Public Information Committee, this is the third one. So this is going to need professional expertise. Lots of these require professional expertise. The honorary treasurer of AA in Great Britain is just one of the board members. Do they necessarily have financial experience? No. Is that wise? Well, maybe not. I'm just going to leave it at that. It makes it really hard for them to answer questions about the finances if they're not trained. And it's not that they're not good people, and it's not their heart isn't in the right place, and it's not that they don't want, they're not doing the job to the best of their ability, but the job requires more. Public Information Committee. Public information in AA, again, it's rather like the finances. You have to balance opposing forces. Uh, the aim is to hail on all frequencies, as they say in Star Trek. So to make sure that you're broadcasting information about AA to everyone who might need it, but you avoid high pressure promotional tactics. So if ever you're now with when listening to any of these aspects, they're all relevant in all sorts of other areas. That stuff about finance, if you want a good, sane and sound ideal for how to manage your own finances, the general principles from the Budget and Finance Committee are pretty good principles. If you're doing any public information work in AA, that dual that pair of principles of hail on all frequencies but avoid high pressure promotional tactics, that's great. That if it's even if it's something as simple as notifying people that, a workshop or a convention is taking place. You make the information broadly available, but you don't use high pressure promotion tactics. You don't multiply bombard people. You don't send WhatsApps to people who don't want the WhatsApps. You just be careful. So there's a balance there. The Literature Committee is the fourth committee. And this requires professional expertise as well. The mission of the Literature Committee to see that an adequate and comprehensive view of AA in its every aspect is held up in writing to our members, friends, and to the world at large. It also says literature is the principal means of facilitating recovery, unity, and service. And there's a balance here. It talks about melding professional considerations with the AA feel. So when the Literature Committee publishes something, it's got to feel like AA literature, as opposed to something which is too slick and too corporate and smacks as though it's someone from outside AA talking about AA. It's got to sound like it's coming from us. It's got to sound like it's coming from the heart. And one of the principles they talk about as well is to consult with representatives of the target audience. So if you're writing a pamphlet aimed at a particular section of the population, you might want to talk to them. You might want to find out what they need. You might want to run drafts past them to make sure that you're not totally, treading on toes. So when I produced a poster for Armed Services Liaison, we ran it past members of the armed services at squaddy level and at officer level, and some of the stock photos we had were not suitable because they made implications because of the type of kit about who it was being aimed at. It would cause ructions within the army if we chose this particular battalion or whatever. So check stuff out with the target audience or you're going to waste a lot of money. The General Policy Committee. Now, this is a very strange beast. I don't know if I think it's still in existence in America. As I say, I'm not really up on the current structure in America. But we're talking about general principles here. So what the board might have to deal with, they get a lot of incomings. And these incomings need to be fielded and triaged so that the board meetings, the actual board meetings, don't get overrun with endless tiny tasks. So the purpose of the General Policy Committee is to triage and to deal with as many small things as possible and farm them out in all sorts of different directions, leaving a much cleaner agenda for the General Service Board plenary meetings, its ordinary meetings. And these general policy committees would have a core of committee members, and then everyone else is invited. So it's like a sort of town hall meeting. So there are, the other trustees are there, the executives are there, the staffs are there, or at least they're invited. So they resolve most things themselves and refer the major matters to the General Service Board. And one thing I've noticed, there's a general principle here, which I think is terribly useful in one's own life. There are a huge number of incomings. There are so many things which could be dealt with. A friend of mine in recovery gave me a triaging system for uh, how to deal with incoming requests, and things to do, things that could be done. You have three in trays. The first one is things which are necessary. So if something is necessary, if something has to be done, it goes into the necessary pile. The second in tray is important. So that's not just necessary, but it's really important as well. And then the third tray is mission critical. And if it doesn't make it into necessary, important, or mission critical, bin it, because you'll never get round to it. And if you are getting round to it, it's because you haven't got enough important things going on in your life, or you're misprioritizing. So feel totally free to bin a huge amount of stuff that comes in, or redirect it. My observation is that a lot of people are most people are too busy, and a few people aren't busy enough. And the ones that are too busy, I think having talked about this to a lot of people, there isn't enough triaging going on. There isn't enough filtering out of what is unimportant or unnecessary or not mission critical, which means that there isn't enough attention given to what is mission critical. Then you start at mission critical and gradually work down through important to necessary. And that's a system which works pretty well, and it's straight out of Concept 11. There are some other phrases and ideas which come directly out of the essays themselves. And they are, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or so of those. The first one is this wonderful phrase, sustained and competent executive direction. So if anyone is in charge of something, you have to have a person in charge. You can't have a board or a committee doing active management. Boards and committees are great for, give me 1 second. Boards and committees are great for general large decisions of policy and finance, large matters of policy, general policy and finance. But they're terrible at managing actual tasks or projects. Projects need to have someone running them. And so you've got to give people plenty of freedom and plenty of authority. Now, this sustained and competent executive direction being headed up in one person. That's the phrase, the catchphrase, being headed up in one person. That means you've got to be really fudging careful who you choose to be the one person in whom the whole operation, the whole project is headed up. Executive ability. This is the second topic. Executive ability is I think it calls it in the essays a rare combination of qualities. So for this executive direction, we were talking about, here's this list of the characteristics you're looking for in someone who you're going to put in charge of a project or an operation. A rare combination of qualities. That's so interesting. That they obviously struggled then as well. So the difficulty in finding the good people to do stuff is the same now as it was then. Here's the list. They inspire people through their energy and example, and that secures people are willing to cooperate with someone who is energetic and leads by good example. Knowing when real firmness is in order. So it's no good being a sort of the North Korean approach doesn't really work in. I hope that's not an outside issue. No, it's not a controversial issue. Okay, so it's fine. The North Korean approach doesn't work, but there's nothing worse than having a blancmange-like chair of something. You know, this sort of wishy-washy person that just wants to please everyone and can't make a decision. So it's such a relief when someone puts their foot down, says, right, we're not going to discuss this anymore because we're not going to get anywhere. Let's do it next week, or let's do it next month. And everyone goes, Oh, what a relief. You know, when those group consciences get derailed because, oh, this person's crying, and that person ran out of the room, and then someone else ran back in the room, and then the person that makes the irrelevant point makes their usual irrelevant point. That rattles everyone on the back row. They know nothing about it. Two of them have been sober since last Sunday, but we have to let everyone. And then the chair comes in and says, look, we're moving away from consensus. Let's produce a document with people's views. We'll circulate it. Let's vote on it in 2027. Okay, fine, good. And that person is bowed down to as a god within AA, someone who is able to cut through the BS and make a decision, just be firm in a situation. Acting without favour or partiality, comprehending and executing large affairs. I've had. Have you ever had a situation where the chair isn't really keeping up, and like 4 or 5 people have to keep informing them what's actually going on because the poor thing is not keeping up? You need the person who's chairing needs to be more agile mentally than anyone else in the room. Ideally, they need to be the person that's furthest ahead. Um, Not neglect. So someone who executes large affairs but doesn't neglect smaller affairs. Someone that takes the initiative in planning. Um, I remember once there was a situation of running a service workshop, and I think it was 3 months between roles being divided up and the workshop. A couple of weeks before the workshop, the chair emails or contacts the person who's in charge of gathering together volunteers. Says, oh, by the way, could you let me have the list of volunteers? Who's doing what? Email addresses and telephone numbers. I need to circulate it. I need to communicate to everyone. So can we have the list? Oh, I don't really know who's. Well, I've got some ideas. I know I'm going to ask this person, and maybe I'll announce it. Nothing had been done in 2.5 months. So if you put someone in charge of something, you want someone that's going to put plans in place that's going to stay ahead of the curve, not just wait until the last minute and then fudge it. Um, and someone who's good at exercising right of decision. So someone who knows when to ask, when to consult, when to act, when to report back. Super helpful to have those 4 verbs memorized for right of decision: act, consult, ask, report. The next thing it talks about is the pitfalls of the executive function. So when do things go wrong? And the examples are very good. A failure to consult sufficiently when new plans affect others. A failure to secure experience and wisdom when devising plans. If you've got someone that's too gung-ho, too proactive, too sure of themselves, too A-type personality, you can deal with that structurally by having like voting mechanisms and reporting mechanisms which keep them in check. So but conversely, if you've got a director or a chair who's weak or indecisive, there are no amount of structural remedies can help that. So if in doubt, go for a chair or a director who is excessively proactive, more likely to get things done in a to exceed their authority, because you can restrain that. Whereas if you've got a pudding sitting there, there's nothing you can't make the pudding do something. So go for someone. There's a greater risk with having a pudding than having someone that's too gung ho. I'm going to regret using that word later on, but there we go. Um, I get it from my mother. She used to refer to my poor father as sitting there like a pudding. That's where it comes from. He's lazy, never does anything. Employing AA members. It's there's a lot in the essay about this, about the fact that most of the employees are probably going to be AA members because they're going to understand the job better. And so there is this sense that there is a spiritual endeavor. So there's a special bond between people that you don't necessarily have in a normal operation, but that mustn't go so far as to mean that you can't correct people where necessary, that you can't be firm where necessary. So in employment situations, or even in structural committee situations, is a business-like approach which you don't have in meetings. It's not you don't go so far as having a 100% corporate setup, because there is a spiritual aspect to it, which as I said, is absent from a corporate setup. But it's not as lovey-dovey as meetings. It's kind of halfway in between the two. Compensation. You pay people the market rate. You don't pay people the charity rate. You pay what they would command in the open market. Cheap help is insecure in its role and it's inefficient. You won't get good work out of them, so don't even try. Even if they're willing and totally happy to do it because they're independently wealthy or something, the trouble is you're setting a precedent for future people in that role, so don't do it. And if they don't want the money, then they can put the money straight back in the pot, but the accounts have to show what the market rate is, otherwise you'll never raise that you're not enabling the fellowship to pay its own way by being financially responsible for the implications, the implementation of the decisions that they're making. Rotation and equal staff pay. This is a very interesting idea, that you pay people based on length of service rather than seniority, and people switch roles once a year so that everyone can cover everyone else's job. Obviously, carved out from that are the roles requiring specific expertise. So the accounts manager and the person that maintains the server, you probably don't want that one rotating. But the other roles, the general office and administrative roles, you get that shared round so everyone can do it. And one of the reasons for this, reading between the lines of the essays, or this essay in particular, you got AA members working for AA in one of the service offices. They're AA members. They're probably a little less stable than ordinary people. There's lots of weirdness because you're dealing with AA people the whole time. So the burnout rate tends to be pretty high. I don't think that's an uncommon experience. And because of that, you need to make sure that everyone can do everyone else's job, just in case, Bobby has to take a few months off. You don't want to be too reliant on any individual. There's the general idea also in the essay, of if everyone is paid the same, and people essentially the same, but that they get paid more the longer they're there. This avoids, according to Bill, destructive competition and politicking. So you basically covered people's costs. Now we can get on with the job. If you do it really well or really badly, it's not going to affect how much you're paid. So people's motivation has to be different. People have to want to do the job because they love it, because money is not going to, you're stopping money from being the primary motivation. So it encourages an entirely different atmosphere. What else do we have? There are a couple of more minor points which I'm probably not going to go into. But the last one on this section is full participation of paid workers. So you don't just give them voting rights. It's covered in concept 4, but you treat them as friends and co-workers, not as subordinates. So it's not a command structure. It's not like a military structure. It is much more collegiate than that, and I think that works for service, and I think that works in the service offices as well. Application in life. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. 5, 6, 7 points. The first one is about final responsibility. We mentioned before that the final responsibility and ultimate authority resides with God. But when I'm given a service responsibility by God, either in my life or in service in AA or in my job, I treat myself as though I have final responsibility. But then when I start to get edgy, I remember actually no, God's totally in charge, but I have to act like I'm in charge. It's no good me saying, oh, God's in charge of everything and not caring about the detail, not doing the job properly. There's a sort of fiction here that you act as though you have final responsibility whilst you're doing the job, and then you let go and remember that God is ultimately responsible, which enables you to be competent but detached, which is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's easy to be detached and incompetent, so you don't care, and then that manifests in your action. How do you act competently but not get attached? Well, this is how you do it. You're operating conceptually on two levels. On the pragmatic level, you're taking responsibility. But in the spiritual level, you recognize you're just an instrument of a higher force. The second big principle, I think, in concept 11 is the necessity of cooperation and delegation to achieve things in life. Certainly, historically, my view, when I was at university, I was studying literature, and I never liked to read secondary literature because it felt like cheating. Like, if I hadn't come up with the idea, it didn't count. So what was the point? And that was dumb. Let me just, D-U-M-B. The necessity of cooperation and delegation to achieve things. When you see people who are burning out, when I've been people who are burning out, there isn't enough cooperation going on. There's not enough delegation. I'm not asking for help. I'm not learning from others. I'm not triaging. I'm trying to do everything. If you've got an Al-Anon stripe down your back, then this is going to be news that you're allowed to trust other people and that there are trustworthy people out there. If your experience is not that, you might need a new experience. There are trustworthy people, and the same principles for who am I going to cooperate with? I mean, that's very much to do with not just in terms of practical projects, but who do I form alliances and interdependencies with? This is with sponsors, sponsees, which group do I belong to? What organizations do I belong to in society? Who am I going to work for? These principles are wonderful. I'm going to repeat them. They were from earlier, but I'm going to repeat them because it's a new context. Careful deliberation, painstaking investigation and interviewing, refusal to accept casual recommendations, preparation well in advance of suitable candidates, avoidance of haste or snap judgment, beware the tendency to reject the first rate out of fear of being outshone. How many hands up anyone that applies those systematically in deciding who to be in a relationship with? Avoidance of haste or snap judgment. Have you ever made a snap judgment and then decided you're going to spend the rest of your life with someone, and then 8 days later you need to have them arrested for some, misdemeanor? How many people? I mean, I've done this. I've accepted jobs, like employment jobs, with insufficient investigation on my part of the organization in question. And if I'd done my homework, I would not have joined the organization in question. So these are really interesting and useful principles. And with hiring commercial third parties to do work, exactly the same thing. Be careful who you pick and pay them properly. If you go for the lowest price, well, you know what you're going to get. I'm amazed at how many helpful tips about life are basically contained in this concept, and no one tells anyone that they're here. Another principle which comes straight from this concept is it comes from where it talks about how you deal with the fact that you've got friends and spiritual compadres working with you either on a service project or in the general service office. The principle is business is business. Business comes first. I've been sponsored by a lot of people. Um, and it's amazing how sponsors with very different spiritual approaches and jiggies would use this same phrase, business is business, in terms of, yeah, be friendly with your sponsees, but, have fun with them, blah, blah, blah. But the sponsorship, the needs of the sponsorship relationship come first. Don't let the personal side of things uh, pull rank over the job that needs to get done. So don't let personal affections or bonds compromise your role, stopping you from saying what needs to be said. The principle of the hard truth. Couple more principles. The principles of sound. I'm going to sneeze. The sneeze is just going to hover, annoying me for the next 2 minutes. It's not going to happen. Okay, so principles of financial management. And I'm just going to repeat these again. Say them again from above, but to think about them now in terms of one's own personal finances. The primary function is to ensure solvency. You've got to keep on top of income and expenditure. How many people record everything they spend so they know what they've spent when they've spent it? How many people will be able to say, over the last year, this is where all of my money has gone down to the last penny or to the last cent. Not a lot of people are on top of what they spend. But how can you make a decision if you don't know what you're spending? Finding ways to increase income. Keeping a cold and watchful eye on needless cost, waste, and duplication. Having a budgeting and forecasting process. Do you budget? Do you forecast? Do you adjust and update those budgets as you progress through the year? Do you keep substantial savings? Do you keep a large proportion of these savings at call? And do you go to the other extreme and oversave and underspend and actually damage the whole purpose of your life because you're not investing where you need to invest? I think these are very helpful questions. There's the notion of the notion of the equality of employees and remuneration, so that everyone is equal in a sense and everyone is paid the same. And associated with that is the idea that higher motives replace lower ego drives for money and prestige. So in my life in general, the real pay that I'm getting from the higher power is sobriety and being in the fourth dimension. And if you think about it, that pay is the same for everyone. Sober is sober. Have you had any gin today? No. Good. Has Bobby had any gin? No, Bobby hasn't. You're both as sober as each other. And the fourth dimension is equally available to everyone. In We Agnostics, I think it talks about broad, roomy, and all-inclusive. That's roomy, R-O-O-M-Y, not R-U-M-I, although that as well. Broad, roomy, and all-inclusive. The fourth dimension, it's the same for everyone. So we're paid the same. If you're going to get paid the same, you've got different motivations. You're doing what you're doing for the love of it, not because you're going to get more fourth dimension. There is only one fourth dimension, and this pay is the market. This is the market rate. So the market rate for what we do in AA is sobriety and the fourth dimension. God isn't asking us to work at the charity rate. God is going to be paying us in full. He's paying us the market rate for what we do, which I think is wonderful. Sometimes people shortchange themselves in recovery. It was a meeting I used to go to up the road. I won't say up which road, I'll just say up the road. So how's that for anonymous? Where I think if the group had a catchphrase, this was many years ago, if the group had a catchphrase, it would be this: sobriety is not a bed of roses. Cheerful, huh? Isn't that? If you've had a hard week, you go to a meeting, and people say, sobriety is not a bed of roses. Well, that gives me hope, doesn't it? Um, Life doesn't stop. There are various related slogans. Life doesn't stop happening just because you're sober. Um, I'm of the opinion that well, and I've observed it, have a habit of shortchanging myself. If I'm anything less than joyful, thinking, well, that's just the way things are. Just look at the world. It's lucky I'm not drinking. I guess not drinking is enough. At any given moment, fine. Like you say, you have a bad day. Don't give yourself a hard time about the fact you've had a bad day. But don't, by the same token, say, well, all I can accept is the scraps off the table. The market rate is a life beyond my wildest dreams. That's the market rate for what I do. And if I'm not accessing that on a reasonably regular basis, then there's something wrong. My sponsor, I've mentioned this before, my sponsor says that sobriety is like sex. If you're not enjoying it, you're doing something wrong. I'm just reporting the Texans' opinion of things. This is not. um, this I think there's an awful lot in this idea of the equality of employees and the equality of remuneration. Um, it means I get to treat small jobs in AA and large jobs in AA as being of the same value. There isn't a differential value. So the small job is as important to God as the large job. I'm not to judge what's small and what's large. Um, so it means I'm willing, one is willing to serve in AA in menial ways and in so-called prestigious ways. There's the phrase best possible. And this is the last point I'm going to talk about. There was the one about the General Policy Committee and its triaging and its prioritization I've talked about. It uses the phrase best possible. And there's a paradox in AA that this mixture of absolutes and relatives, and it comes to the fore most prominently in the chapter How It Works, where it says we had to let go absolutely, which is complete. In Bill's story, turning to the Father of Light who presides over us all to turn to him in all matters. At the end of to wives, it talks about placing the problem along with everything else in God's hands. There's lots of absolute stuff. The step 3 prayer, the step 7 prayer are pretty absolute. The step 11 prayer is pretty absolute. But then it talks about progress, not perfection. And in the 12 and 12 and 6 and 7, it talks about how you'll never be perfect, blah, blah, blah. But I think it's important to keep the two ideas separate. So to aim for perfection, but to be content with whatever actually comes out in terms of progress. And this does require a person to hold two ideas in their mind at the same time. And it talks about in the big book, the most satisfactory years of your life lie ahead. And that can be understood in lots of ways. One way is to say the most satisfying years of your life lie ahead. And I've learned, in my case, that satisfaction comes out of doing what is in front of me to the best of my ability, even if no one is watching. And if you like it, great. And if you don't, you can get someone else to do it next time. I'll find something else to do. I won't be bored, so it's fine. But and Brother Lawrence talks about this. You pick up a leaf off the ground as though it is for God. And just because you can't see the purpose doesn't mean there isn't a purpose, which means you have to do each thing as though it has a purpose. And I'm going to finish on this line. There's a spiritual principle that in some traditions that God is in charge of the details. God didn't just wind up the universe like a huge music box and then walk away whilst the melody gradually dies off into the darkness. That God is like intimately involved in all sorts of details. And there is a grand design even behind the smallest things. And two people are walking along and a leaf falls off a tree. It's stormy, a leaf falls off a tree. And one person says to the other one, "Oh, so God's in charge of that leaf falling off the tree, is he?" And the other person picks up the leaf and there's a tiny little caterpillar under the leaf, and he puts the leaf back and says, "Yes, look, that caterpillar needed somewhere to shelter from the storm, so God arranged for the leaf to fall down with the caterpillar so the caterpillar would be protected." Now, if you're of a belligerent mindset, I'm sure you can find a way of arguing with the logic of that, in which case, knock yourself out. I'm just going to stand back and let you argue that with yourselves. But I like the idea there that there is a pattern behind the seeming um, chaos of the universe and pointlessness, sometimes what seems to be the pointlessness of the universe, which is why I must do everything in the best possible way, to aim for the best possible, even if I don't understand why. There's a Karl Kraus quote, but maybe I'll say it next time. I'm going to stop there. I've gone on for more than an hour. Thanks for listening.